If you look at the process we follow, it's pretty much the same whether we're dealing with a company directly or we're dealing with a company that is supporting NASA. So the COTS program is a perfect example of this non-traditional acquisition program that NASA has used on occasion. And again, we license the company, but we work very closely with NASA to make sure that roles and responsibilities are understood and we don't have any duplication or confusing signals to the company. Another very good example is the EFT-1 flight, Exploration Flight Test Mission 1, which took place recently. That was a big, important milestone for NASA as they tested out the Orion capsule that will be used in future exploration missions. But actually, NASA didn't carry out that operation. Lockheed Martin had responsibility for the Orion, and so they had to get a reentry license from the FAA. United Launch Alliance launched the Delta IV Heavy under an FAA launch license. So NASA was essentially the customer for that mission, and they bought lots of data from Lockheed Martin to better understand the performance of the heat shield and other aspects of the capsule. The kinds of applications that we receive really depends on the mission itself. For suborbital mission, you just need a single license or permit. If you're launching a satellite to orbit, then you'd probably need a launch license. Sometimes we actually bring the spacecraft back to Earth, and in that case, you'd want to have a reentry license. And there could be different parties that receive those licenses, or it could be one company that has them all. Reentry licenses are required when the plan is for the spacecraft to survive reentry and land and be recovered then. So if the plan involves disposing of trash from the International Space Station and allowing the capsule just to burn up in the atmosphere during a reentry, such as is the case for the Cygnus, then a reentry license is not required in that case. When there are different government agencies involved, it can be a very complex interrelationship between all the parties. We certainly do our best to make clear what the roles and responsibilities are of each of the agencies. In general, for a government launch, NASA can carry that out on its own in cooperation with the Air Force at the range. Air Force can do the same when they're carrying out a launch. When we're talking about a commercial launch, then the FAA has its responsibility both for the launch and for reentry, if applicable on that mission. What happens on orbit is pretty much the Wild West. There actually is no U.S. agency that is in charge of safety or avoiding collisions in terms of what happens in space. Now, when the spacecraft approaches the International Space Station, then NASA, of course, at that point would take responsibility for ensuring that the rendezvous and docking is conducted safely. Currently, the FAA is responsible for regulating both launches and reentries, but not for what happens in space. And as we look at what's going on, especially in the commercial world today, there's a lot of satellites, a lot of CubeSats, a lot of space junk, orbital debris, and I don't know how many of you were able to see the movie Gravity, but there are some very graphic depictions of what can happen on a bad day when two satellites run into each other. So there's been a lot of talk lately about whether the federal government could institute an improved process to oversee what happens in space. There are a number of different agencies that have particular responsibilities. Again, FAA with launch and reentry. We have the FCC that is responsible for radio broadcasts. NOAA actually has responsibility for those who want to take pictures of the Earth, remote sensing, and so forth. But there's no one really who looks after the safety and the transportation aspects of what happens on orbit. So I think at some point in the next several years, we may see the government come together and decide that we want to address that in terms of how the federal government provides space traffic management services, if you will, with the primary goal being to avoid collisions and the creation of additional orbital debris.